Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Grave of the Fireflies from 1988. Now, this is continuing my series where I review all the films released by Studio Ghibli. This was part of the double feature that Studio Ghibli put out with My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies. In a lot of ways, I think Grave of the Fireflies is a culmination of something that Takahata had been trying to do with animated film for his entire career, which is to have animation taken more seriously and to make a film that would demand it be taken more seriously. And I can't think of a film that gets more people who aren't necessarily critics who love animation to be shocked at the power an animated film could have over them. It's like a lot of his films, and certainly his last two films, Shay the Brat and Gochi the Cellist, where it's very much a modest story. This is more neorealism than the other two, but this is just as modest in terms of its storytelling. Now, this is a very faithful adaptation of the book Grave of the Fireflies, which is a Japanese book written by Ayaki Nosasaka, and the book has actually never been translated, or at the time I'm shooting this, I haven't heard of it ever being translated into English. The author of the book went through a similar experience with his young sister, and he never forgave himself for her death of starvation. Even though he was trying to get food for her, he'd always eat first, and then he'd give her food, and he always felt like he was partly to blame for her death. I didn't read the book, but apparently it's fairly faithful. They kind of changed the tense, whereas in the book you're not sure who the narrator really is. You kind of guess that it kind of is Seta, but you're not really sure. And in this film, it's Seta's spirit who meets up with Setsuko's spirit, and they kind of tell you the tale. And so the tense kind of changes, but the story is basically the same. Two children, Seta and Setsuko, are being evacuated with their mom from their village, and their mom is leaving separate from them, and she is mortally burned during the firebombing of their town, and their town is basically destroyed. They have no home. Their mother eventually dies of the wounds from the firebombing, and their father's off at war, so they try to live with their aunt, who takes them in, but her kindness doesn't last very long, and she's suddenly sick of having to take care of these two orphans, so then they go try to survive on their own in a cave they have found and try to live by themselves and survive in the latter part of World War II in Japan. This film, I think you could take it and the effect it has on you as anti-war, and I don't know if it's that direct about it. I think it's just showing the effects of war on a populace. This is really stripped down and bare what Takahata's doing here, and he's showing you if you were to live in one of these places where there's a war going on. And that's pretty hard to imagine for us as Americans, because we've never really had a war happen on our soil in a very long time, especially from another enemy. I think this shows what you have to live through. Now, you could take that as anti-war. Takahata doesn't see it as an anti-war film. He's actually the only person who worked on this film who lived through the firebombings. Everyone else was too young. And it brings forth that perspective of what you have to live through, which is an interesting way to show a war film. Roger Ebert says it's one of his favorite war films ever made, and I'd have to agree, because it takes such a different perspective of a war film than most war films do. And I often think about that when there's a tragedy, or you hear about a tragedy from the past in history, how there were whole families probably wiped out, or maybe there were whole families and like just the daughter who's young survived, and what her life would be like, and what these tragedies do to whole towns and whole families and just devastate them. And when you see Seta and Setsuko, you see what can happen at the beginning of the film. You see him in a train station dying of starvation. Where else does he have to go? He doesn't want to go back to his aunt, who's rather cruel, who's rather mean, who's not going to help him out really. He has no other options. There's a lot of people who get affected by that, whether it's in the Middle East or Vietnam or the Korean War, whichever war, who get affected in that way, and their lives are completely changed. And the author of the book that this film was based on had that experience happen to him, where he was the only survivor from his family. That's why he wrote this book. It's a well-regarded book in Japan, and I think it shows you how humans need to survive, but also humanity's cruelty, that these two were left alone. And people have this attitude that adults often have, that, oh, well, it's not my problem, this is what you should do, and then don't look into it. I mean, he's a teenager, she's a 5-year-old girl. They don't really know what they're doing and how to survive, but everyone kind of acts like they'll be fine and they'll figure it out. Sometimes I get mad at the adults in this film. You kind of just let this happen. Like when that farmer gets Seta for stealing crops, he's like so into getting him in trouble, but as soon as the adult's in trouble for beating on a minor, he disappears. He doesn't even care that he's the only person that his sister has. He's not being a thief in a way that's greedy. He's doing it to survive, and like people didn't really care because it's wartime. This shows the part of war that isn't as attention getting, and in a way this film isn't as attention getting. It's so stripped down. I can understand when I've read negative reviews of this film. If you watch Studio Ghibli films, and Miyazaki's a lot more commercial, not to dilute him as a filmmaker in comparison, but he's a lot more commercial. It seems like Takahata, who's a lot older, by the way. I think a lot of people forget Takahata is a lot older than Miyazaki. Miyazaki actually started working under the direction of Takahata, and they eventually made Studio Ghibli. Takahata likes making these modest, well-made films, and he was kind of that modest, very thoughtful, intelligent director. And he holds on shots a lot longer, that the cuts in his films become less and less frequent. And it kind of feels like when I watch his first film, Hollis, Prince of the Sun, to when I watch this film, there's a sense that he's confident enough in the storyteller at this time that he kind of doesn't care if you like it or not. And he's like, this is the story I'm gonna tell. And there's a feeling throughout it that all he really cared about was telling the story effectively and being able to tell this well-regarded story. Now, he had done that with Gucci the Cellist and Shay the Brat also, but I think in this regard, this was a book that would be more considered for a live-action adaptation. And it was later made into TV adaptations for Japanese TV. When you're thinking about an adaptation of a book, you really wouldn't think of this kind of a book being animated. I think that's one of the reasons Takahata is such a great filmmaker to pick for this, because he had something to prove with it, but he also didn't care about proving it. I've sensed that in both this and in Totoro from both him and Miyazaki, that there's this sense in Studio Ghibli that they really wanted to make these kind of amazing pieces of art. I don't think Grave of the Fireflies could have been made if Isao Takahata wasn't in charge of Studio Ghibli. And more so than Totoro. This film is less accessible, but almost more powerful. It's really hard to watch this film without having an emotional impact. I couldn't watch this that many times just because I'd like to have the remaining remnants of my soul intact, and watching this too many times close together would just ruin my faith in humanity. It always kind of brings me close to tears, or just rips out my soul and makes me think about war and conflict in a way that makes you feel the weight of war and people who get forgotten in major conflicts. I've seen this film 3 times. Each time I've had a completely different experience watching it. Now, obviously the scenes that you know are powerful are still powerful every time I watched it, but the role of the spirits telling the story meant a lot more the second time I watched it before reviewing this film. It left me with the foreboding feeling that since I had just watched it recently, I knew it was going to happen. You know what's going to happen to these characters. It's set up right at the beginning. But having already experienced it, those spirits have this foreboding feeling that they know what's coming. That's a scary thing, and that's a sad thing. When you see images of people in this terrible conflict, you can't imagine their life could be easy, and I think that goes through Grave of the Fireflies. It's not a tragedy. The first time I watched it, I viewed it as more of a tragedy. It really shows what their life was like during this time. Them playing on the beach, Seta trying to bring her spirits up, trying to find clothes, going on adventures, going to hospitals, everything like that. It's all in there, so it just doesn't feel like just a tragedy. It really just feels like you're seeing what their lives were like at this time, and how damaged it was, and how impacted it was by the war, and what it's like living through that. The Japanese have made a lot of good films about the post-World War II Japan, but I don't think any of them hit you in the gut as much as Grave of the Fireflies does, and devastates you as much. I think that's why people look at this film and go, oh my god, an animated film can do that to me? I'm used to animated films where they're singing flowers and crabs and crap. I'm used to that. Animated films can't do that. And I think that's the thing Takahata always worked towards, was making you take animation seriously and showing you Certainly, animation can be for kids and it can be very powerful, but it can also be so much more. And I think Grave of the Fireflies is Takahata's most well-known film, especially in America. In fact, most of the reviews I read of this all admitted they had not seen another Takahata film before. It's kind of unfortunate because he made other good films before this. This is obviously probably his masterpiece. It's interesting that this film represents the legacy he wanted to have when he really started in this industry, that he wanted animation to be taken more seriously, and he demanded it so and tried and tried and tried. And then it's like when he reached the 70s and 80s, it's like he just went, you know what, fuck it. I'm just gonna make these movies that will give an emotional resonance and an impact and have animated scenes that just show something about the character and aren't necessarily about having a crazy sequence, and going to make his own kind of distinctive animated films. As much as Miyazaki, who is pretty much how I got into Studio Ghibli, Takahata is equally a genius of animation for what he's not doing that other animated films really do. And that's probably true for both of them, but more so for Takahata because he's so much more reserved. He's so much more thoughtful in his shots, that one of the shots that I find the most impactful and devastating and amazing and emotional shots is after Seda sees his mother dying in the bandages. There's just that shot of him and his back, and you see Setsuko playing with whoever that woman was, I don't know, and you just see this long landscape and you realize like the world he has to go into, and all of that is in that shot. You're thinking about what he's thinking about, you're thinking about what he has to go through, and you're left with your thoughts. So you're really kind of stuck with this character who you know a little about, but as the film goes on, when he does more shots like that, when he just shows you something through these like longer takes, the way he uses the editing and the frame in this film really leaves you with your thoughts and makes you think about the moral decisions that are being made in front of you. So it's really letting you deal with that in a way that I don't think people were used to an animated film doing. Now, this film didn't get released in America until about the early 2000s, which is pretty terrible, I think. It should have probably been released before. I'm noticing that with a lot of these Studio Ghibli films, is it took them a while to get over here. That was really the major release. I think I saw this before then, maybe. I might be giving myself a little too much credit there, but I remember it being out and being misfiled in Blockbuster under action and anime section, and it kind of wasn't really given the due it should have been. But I feel like over time, this film is so amazing and so powerful that you can't deny it. And I think that's what Takahata always wanted. It's an amazing thing to see all these films by a filmmaker and see him accomplish this really lofty goal that in 1988 seemed probably more impossible than it is now. Grave of the Fireflies is an amazing film. It's an emotional film. It shows what you can do with animation. As someone who's watching all of Takahata's films, I think it shows what Isao Takahata could do as an animator and a director, and why he was such an amazing animation auteur, and why he's so important to the industry, is that he demanded animation become something like this and be able to handle a story like this, and he did it and he succeeded. And that's one of the things when I was watching Grave of the Fireflies recently, after having watched all these films, made me go and think, wow, yeah, that's what he wanted to do. And not only did he do it, he made a very complex emotional film in a way that I don't think people are used to in animation, and got animation to be taken more seriously by a lot of people who maybe already were taking it kind of seriously. But if you see this, you can't not take animation seriously, because this film is so powerful. It hits you in the stomach when you see everything these kids go through. It's just an amazing piece of work, and I think one of the best films Studio Ghibli ever made. Grave of the Fireflies is one that certainly a lot of people don't like to watch as much and as frequently because it has that impact on you, but it has an impact on me in a way that I never forget those final scenes. I never forget that impact it had on me, even if I had seen it more than like 10 to 12 years before I had reviewed this. That says the power of this film and the power of Takahata's direction. So if you have seen Grave of the Fireflies and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. So I will have more Studio Ghibli films more frequently. Doing My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies are two really important films for this series, so I really wanted to spend time on them and read as much as I could and research as much as I could. So it took a while, so I apologize for these being so delayed, there really wasn't a Studio Ghibli film in August, so I apologize for that. They will be more frequently. Check out the review playlist in the annotation below. There will at least be one more this month. Believe me, trust me, it's gonna happen. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.